It's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video, and this time this will be my second part of my reaction to the first episode in the early Muslim Expansion documentary series by Kings and Generals. Now, as I explained in the first part, that because this first episode is roughly 2 hours long, I'm splitting this down into 3 parts. So excuse me. And well, that's how it was ordered on the playlist I got up here. So so the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical, if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, is probably obvious. I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. With that being said, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Kings and Generals. They were another great history channel on YouTube, and and yeah, again, if you haven't seen my reaction to the first part, of this episode, I suggest you check that one out before checking this one out. So without rambling on too much longer, let's get up on screen and carry on with this first episode.
To surrender. The Arab commander spent the next few months building up a new administration in the region and collecting taxes. At the same time, raiding parties were sent to central Iraq and towards the border of the Eastern Roman Empire, and this raiding brought both loot and information on enemy movement. Some sources claim that the Caliphate gained a degree of control over central Iraq, but it seems that Khalid didn't have enough troops to keep such a wide region under his authority. Still, the Caliphate's raiding parties were not getting much resistance to the north and northeast, while his scouts informed him that the Sassanid garrisons to the northwest were still intact, with larger concentrations at Anbar and Ain al-Tamr. The first one was further away, and the direct route to it was through Ain al-Tamr, but attacking the fort of Anbar would have been more unexpected. So, in late June of 633, Khalid left half of his troops in Al-Hira and...
Yeah, it's always great if you got the element of surprise on your hand, especially if Anbar is as well garrisoned as it claimed to be.
And marched west towards Anbar with a 10,000 strong army. Anbar would become the first Arab attack across the Euphrates River. The details of the engagement that happened here are unclear, but it seems that Khalid's decision to attack Anbar surprised his opponents, and the leader of the garrison, Shirzad, was forced to surrender after the Arab archers showed their effectiveness. Then the Caliphate's raiding parties approached the town of Ain al-Tamr from the direction of Al-Hira, so when Khalid engaged the Sassanid troops, mostly made up of Christian Arabs from the west, in July, he was able to win with relative ease. The leader of the Christian Arabs was taken prisoner and then executed, and the city surrendered to the Muslims. Events of the next few months between July and September are shrouded in mystery, as some sources claim that Khalid was staying in Anbar and Ain al-Tamr, slowly setting up the administration of the newly acquired region, which seems uncharacteristically passive for him. Others claim that the last 2 remnants of the apostate activity of the Ridda Wars were to the south, so Khalid moved most of his non-garrisoned troops towards Dormat al-Jandal and helped his fellow Caliphate general, Ayad bin Ghanem, defeat the rebels in the region. This inactivity or absence gave some time to the Sassanids, and they started recruiting and concentrating 5 armies in the area between Mazaya and Husayd. Kaka bin Amr, who was left to command the garrison at Al-Hira, ordered the raiding parties in central Iraq and the garrisons of Anbar and Ain al-Tamr to take positions to the south of the Sassanid forces, delay them as much as possible, and not allow these 4 small armies to unite into one force. At the end of September, Khalid returned to Al-Hira alongside the troops he picked up around Domat al-Jandal and ordered Kaka bin Amr and Abu Layla to lead portions of the garrison to Husayd and Kenafis respectively and take command, while his troops rested in the city. Apparently, small Muslim and Sassanid armies fought minor battles in October, and the Sassanids suffered minor defeats, which compelled them to retreat towards Muzayyah. Khalid now had an open route to the Sassanid capital, Ctesiphon, but the Sassanid army at Muzayyah and the concentrations of the Christian Arabs in the area between Sana'i and Zumail were still a threat, so the Caliphate commander decided against attacking Ctesiphon. The main Sassanid army at Muzayyah...
Again, not an expert, but I think if Khalid decide to attack Ctesiphon directly, even with all these troops here, I'm pretty sure with all this Sassanid, all the Sassanids here, they could even attack him from behind. But then I could be wrong, because it feels like if he did try to concentrate all his attack on Ctesiphon, all these Sassanid troops can attack him from the rear, because it's not entirely sure how well garrisoned these Muslim forces are here.
Yeah,
sorry, I could have said that better.
Its position to be safe, since it would be difficult to attack them without going through Sana'i and Zumail. At the same time, Khalid knew that attacking the majority light cavalry Arab Christians could push them to the north to unite with the troops at Muzayyah, so Khalid devised a plan. His army was already divided into 3 corps, and they moved directly against the Persians using the desert to avoid Sana'i and Zumail. This was technically very difficult, as all 3 corps had to not only bypass the enemy armies without being detected, but also arrive at the decided location simultaneously. It was risky, but the possible reward was also high. Everything worked as planned. Khalid's corps converged on the target at the same time, and during one of the nights in the first week of November, his 20,000 attacked the sleeping Sassanid army of comparable size. The latter was not expecting this attack, and the army of the Caliphate scored an easy victory, killing more than 10,000 Sassanid warriors. After that, defeating a smaller Christian Arab force seemed easy, but instead of confronting them head-on, Khalid repeated his 3-pronged maneuver to avoid losses. The Muslims suffered minimal losses, while the Christian Arabs lost more than half of their army. Apparently, a few recent Muslim converts were among the killed, and their families sent an appeal to the Caliph Abu Bakr to punish Khalid. This rejected appeal was sent through the future Caliph Umar, and will become important for our story down the line. Khalid's mobility and the inability of his opponents to consolidate their forces meant that the region between Muzayyah and Al-Hira was now under the control of the Caliphate. We have sparse information on the early administration of these lands. The Muslim sources claim that while the Persians living in the cities were often taken captive and enslaved, the local Arab population was forced to pay the jizya tax, but was otherwise allowed a degree of autonomy and even freedom of worship. More raids were sent across the Euphrates in the next month, while Khalid was contemplating what his next move should be. Attacking Ctesiphon was still dangerous, as that would have stretched the supply lines too much. That made an attack on the only Sassanid target in the area.
You gotta admit, you can't help but appreciate the forethought that a load of these generals, whether they be Middle Eastern, European, Asian, American, the amount of forethought that goes into these tactics is spectacular and quite I don't know how to really say it properly, but it is quite amazing with the amount of forethought that a load of these great generals throughout history have. Sorry, my mind nearly went blank then, just trying to complete that sentence. Mind you, That's what I get for recording this at gone midnight.
The city of Faraz the only option. Faraz was right on the border of the Sassanid and Eastern Roman empires. Khalid and his 20,000 reached the area in December. Once again, the sources are conflicted, but a few details that have reached our times allow us to form a coherent timeline. We know that the local Sassanid and Roman garrisons united their strength on the north side of the Euphrates, while Khalid held the crossing on the other side. Despite the fact that the Muslim sources state that the united Roman Sassanid force was large, it is fair to assume that neither empire could have a large force in the area, since the Sassanids needed those troops in central Iraq, while the Romans were concentrating their own forces on the crucial coastal areas and urban centres already being raided by the smaller Muslim armies. Even with a united force and the inclusion of the local Arab tribes, the allies, led by the Sassanid commander, Qadisiyyah, probably had between 15 and 25,000 troops. For 5 or 6 weeks, the armies remained opposite each other, as neither side had a safe place to cross the river. It seems that sometime in the 3rd week of January, Khalid slightly retreated from the positions he held, perhaps baiting his counterpart into attacking. Indeed, the allied force crossed the river and formed up against the Muslims. Both sides had a similar disposition, with infantry in the centre and cavalry on the wings. The allied army charged the Muslims, probably hopeful that their heavier equipment would give them an advantage. Slowly but surely, this charge pushed Khalid's lines back. Simultaneously, the Muslim general ordered the cavalry units from the second rank to leave the main body and take position to the far left. The Roman Sassanid army continued to advance, and the Muslims retreated even further. Khalid's detached force was ordered to take the bridge and then attack the allies from the rear. This maneuver was successful, and Qadisiyyah's army immediately started losing cohesion. The allies thought that there was another big Muslim army that took the bridge and would soon surround them.
I mean, that's also a smart thing that I've seen generals use, is like where they've managed to send a small force behind, kill the leader, and sometimes your enemy thinks that you have another extra large army on the way. It's smart, even though from my perspective, it is quite risky, because not everyone will fall for such a tactic.
Simultaneously, Khalid's main force started their counterattack, and those units of the allied army not killed on the spot started routing towards the northeast. A certain number managed to swim across the river, but more than half of the allied army was killed. Khalid lost a few hundred from his ranks. Khalid was about to attack deeper into Persian territory, but he soon after received a letter from the Caliph Abu Bakr at the Rashidun capital of Medina. The letter ordered him to cease his attacks on the Sassanids and to move into Syria to battle the Romans. So Khalid and a small contingent of his army prepared to move west. As with the Mesopotamian invasions, there had probably been no better opportunity for a strike into Roman lands, as the destructive quarter-century-long conflict from 602 to 628 had undermined crucial defences in both regions. The Roman East, with all its religious, cultural, financial and strategic significance, was now dangerously vulnerable. During 633, the Muslims sent 4 separate corps to invade Palestine, in addition to the areas around the Sea of Galilee, the River Jordan and the Dead Sea. Though they achieved success, assaults on the large urban settlements of the region could not be considered until reinforcements were brought up. So, both for the additional troops and for Khalid's expertise in warfare, Abu Bakr sent the order for him to move west. To save time and to bypass Roman defences, the Muslim general chose a more dangerous route through an especially desolate, waterless stretch of the Syrian desert, much to the alarm of his sub-commanders. In order to survive, it is reported that Khalid, in his ingenuitive way, ordered 20 camels be forced to drink large amounts of water so that they could be used as makeshift storage tanks. The beasts were then periodically slaughtered along the journey when nourishment was needed, and the water was then harvested from the camels. After 5 grueling days of marching through this desolate landscape, the 9,000-strong Muslim army emerged at Suwa. Then they swiftly inflicted a minor defeat on the Roman Arab clients, the Ghassanids, at Marj al-Rahit, while they were celebrating Easter. Proving his strategy correct, Khalid's improbable desert crossing had also neutralized the Byzantine defenses on the Arabian border. Now he turned south, towards the Syrian town of Bosra, where the arrival of his reinforcements led to its capture by mid-July of 634. Despite this success, the Muslims had little time to celebrate. Roman Emperor Heraclius, who was now in Emesa, sent his brother Theodore and an Armenian general named Wardan south towards Ajnadayn, 25 miles southeast of Jerusalem, where they began to gather a large army. Spies reported this gathering force to the invaders, and the burgeoning Caliphate's army marched to meet their Byzantine opponents. Very few hard facts are known about this battle, but we can reconstruct a version of the fight using the available sources. Muslim accounts vastly exaggerate the number of Roman troops they faced, and it is likely even that the weakened Byzantine forces in Syria, 10,000 strong and commanded by Wardan and Theodore, were outnumbered by the 15,000 Muslims. Both armies formed up in extended lines, with their camps to the rear, and both sides stood ready with 3 divisions of infantry, right, left and centre, while each wing had a cavalry flank guard. Behind the Muslim centre was a small reserve, and in front of their centre was a small group of champions. Before the battle began, a Christian bishop rode over to Khalid's army and attempted to negotiate a Muslim withdrawal. However, the Rashidun general simply responded by offering the traditional choice: conversion to Islam, payment of the jizya tax, or death in battle. The fighting at Ajnadayn began when the Byzantine auxiliary missile units, stationed ahead of the main line, began to rain arrows and stones on their adversaries. As the superior Byzantine ranged units loosed, the Muslims suffered losses and were unable to respond. However, one Muslim warrior named Dirar, heavily armoured and brandishing a heavy shield, stolen from a Roman soldier, marched directly into the arrow fire, shouting his war cry. After the hail of missiles ceased, Dirar and his entourage of fellow champions were met by their Byzantine counterparts, and it is said the Muslims got the better of the fighting, slaying several Roman elite warriors and 2 generals. As the dueling came to an end, the Rashidun army attacked, and the subsequent fighting was a slogging match with little manoeuvre, and lasted until nightfall. The next day, Byzantine commander Wardan attempted to lure Khalid into a trap by offering a parley, but the plan went wrong and he was instead killed by the fearsome Dirar. Aiming to exploit the confusion which this loss of leadership caused in the Roman ranks, the Arabs attacked again, with their flanks in front and centre behind. After savage hand-to-hand fighting, which exhausted and depleted both armies, Khalid deployed his 4,000-strong reserve in the centre and drove deep wedges through the Roman formations in this area. Unable to withstand the pressure any further, their line collapsed. After this defeat, Emperor Heraclius sent his brother Theodore back to Constantinople in disgrace. At the same time, the remnants of his shattered army, in addition to the local Roman population, withdrew to the apparent safety of the walled cities, which subsequently became crowded with refugees. Perhaps an omen of things to come, Heraclius then retreated with his headquarters further north to the city of Antioch, due to the fact that Muslim forces now controlled the countryside and were expected to advance on the most prominent urban centre in the area. A week after their victory at Ajnadayn, the Arab forces began to march north in the direction of Damascus. On their way, they had to leave a mounted detachment at the city of Fal, ancient Pella, to keep the Roman garrison there tied down while the main army marched onward. After this was done, the Muslims reached Yakusa on the southern bank of the Yarmouk river. Here they were opposed by a blocking force of Byzantine troops on the northern shore. They were in no real position to offer serious permanent resistance, but they were there to delay the invaders and to allow the great city to further prepare for a coming siege. After a short battle here and another battle against 12,000 Romans at the Yellow Meadow, otherwise known as Major Safar, the road was clear to Damascus. When the invading Arabs neared the city, the Muslim commander realized that his forces were not numerous enough to encircle it entirely. Instead, each of the Muslim sub-commanders stationed their contingents outside of the city's various gates, fully blockading the crucial thoroughfares by August 21st with a total of around 20,000 soldiers, 16,000 infantry and 4,000 mobile guard cavalry. Damascus immediately began starving due to the lack of supplies and unpreparedness for a siege, while the Muslims were well supplied due to their domination of the fertile and productive local countryside. As the swift Arab light horsemen were relatively useless in a siege, Khalid ibn al-Walid sent a few hundred of them to the Eagle's Pass to the north.
Well, unless you can got siege equipment to punch a nice big hole through the wall for the cavalry to charge through, providing there's no traps for cavalry. But
in order to act,
for those who already know about medieval warfare, cavalry are weak. The weakness for cavalry is soldiers with pole arms.
As scouts. Here they watched for any Byzantine relief force aiming to pass through this choke point. The other half stayed near the city as a reserve, ready to help repel any sortie made by the Romans. In Antioch, the Roman emperor learned of the siege and sent a 12,000-strong relief force, along with plentiful supplies, to help Damascus on September 9th. When this force reached the narrow pass where the Muslim scouts were stationed, they pushed the cavalry back. One of these scouts managed to send notice to al-Walid, and he, gambling that repelling the relief attempt was more important than maintaining too tight a blockade, took the remaining cavalry at night to the Eagle Pass, where he managed to rout the Romans. Despite their apparent success, the besieging Arab forces were now stretched thin by Khalid's withdrawal. Historians believe that if the garrison's general Thomas had chosen to launch a sortie at this point, the Byzantines could have broken the siege, but they did not and therefore lost the opportunity. It seems that al-Walid realized he had put the siege in danger with his gamble, and he hurriedly returned to Damascus after he attained victory at the Eagle's Pass. As the garrison and Thomas realized that no relief was coming, morale among the defenders of Damascus became weaker and weaker. It was clear action would be needed. So, the emperor's son-in-law decided to launch a counter-offensive of his own. For this first attack, Thomas decided to concentrate on one specific section of the city, drawing men together from all sectors of the city towards the gate of Thomas, where he was faced by around 5,000 soldiers under Shurabil. After the defending soldiers gathered in the area, the Byzantine commander began his sortie by ordering his archers to rain down a constant stream of arrows against their enemy, to which the Arabs responded accordingly. Using the cover granted by the Roman missile units, the infantry rushed through the gate of Thomas and fanned out into battle formation, with Thomas himself leading the assault. During the subsequent skirmish, it is reported that Thomas both broke through a section of the Muslim line and almost killed Shurabil, but he was then shot in the eye by the widow of a slain Arab soldier. Despite some level of success, the sortie had failed to break the siege, and the Byzantine forces retreated into the city. As they did, it is said that the injured Roman leader swore to take 1,000 eyes in return for his own. That night, another plan to break the siege was devised by the defenders. As a concentrated attack on one of the gates had failed, Thomas would this time launch simultaneous strikes from 4 of the gates. 2 large forces were gathered, at the eastern gate where Khalid was in command, and at the Gate of Thomas, where the main attack against exhausted enemy units would be undertaken. The other forces at the small gate and the Qadisiyyah gate were designed to pin their besiegers in place. As Thomas sounded the attack, a grinding battle took place at the Qadisiyyah gate, with both sides suffering many losses. After a while of this slaughter, Abu Ubaidah and his forces at this gate managed to doggedly repulse the Byzantine assault, driving them back into the city. The situation was far more serious at the eastern gate, where the Byzantines had a larger force. This larger contingent of defenders managed to break the Arab infantry and drive them back, but Khalid himself then arrived with 400 elite mobile guard cavalry, and with them struck the Roman flank. This weakened the sortie irreversibly, and the defenders were slowly driven back inside the gates. Once again, however, the worst of the fighting occurred at the Gate of Thomas. Here, the Byzantine forces were led by the one-eyed Thomas himself, and after intense fighting, there was still no weakness in the Muslim ranks. At this point, the Roman commander seems to have realized there was no point in continuing the grinding melee, and commanded a slow, steady withdrawal. All the while, the Arab archers continually showered his men with arrows. This was the last effort by Thomas to break the Muslim siege, and it had failed with the loss of thousands of men. With this defeat, he could no longer afford any more attempts at a breakout. A Greek in Damascus, known as Jonah the Lover in Arab sources, climbed over the wall and informed Khalid that on the night of the 18th of September there would be a Christian religious ceremony which would leave the walls relatively unguarded.
Oh, wow.
He supposedly betrayed his city because his marriage to his fiancée had been interrupted by the siege, and, frustrated, asked for the Muslims' help in obtaining said bride. This man soon converted to Islam, but the details are incredibly vague. Whatever the case, details of the opportunity led Khalid to borrow ladders from a local monastery and to purchase ropes in order to form an assault party. That night, a 100-strong contingent, led by the Muslim general himself, climbed the walls, dropped into the city and killed the guards at the eastern gate. Then the attackers flung open the gate and let the remainder of the Muslim forces at the eastern gate inside the city. The other Byzantine detachments stationed elsewhere were unaware of this surprising development, and instead of helping, stayed at their posts. At the same time, Khalid began to fight his way towards the center of the city. Now attempting to save the city for a final time, Thomas sent envoys to Abu Ubaidah at the western Qadisiyyah gate, offering surrender and a payment of the jizya in exchange for a capitulation by terms. This was given by the supposedly peace-loving Abu Ubaidah. However, Khalid, who had finished slaughtering his way to the center of the city, was furious that a surrender had been allowed even though the city had technically been taken by storm. Nevertheless, the many Muslim unit commanders agreed that a surrender would be honoured. Khalid reluctantly accepted this judgment. The fall of Damascus was a shock for the Byzantines, as they probably thought that the...
Yeah, because I suppose, even though Khalid was in charge, but I suppose with that amount of men agreeing to the surrender by the Byzantine or Eastern Romans, I suppose you would have to reluctantly agree, because everyone else in his army said it's in the best interest to accept the surrender.
The Muslim attack on the region was a massive raid and not a full-on invasion. Syria and Egypt were the most important provinces of the empire, and the fall of the former would mean that the land route to the latter was cut, and it was now also vulnerable to being occupied. Emperor Heraclius couldn't allow that, so he started sending orders to the provinces in order to bring in more reinforcements to the region. Simultaneously, the political situation in the Caliphate had also changed, as Caliph Abu Bakr passed away in late August of that year, and was replaced by Umar. The new Caliph immediately started implementing administrational and military reforms, creating new administrative positions in the provinces, and changing the formation of the army from the one created on the tribal principle to a more centralized one. Immediately after his ascension, Umar sent a letter to the army, relieving Khalid of his post and appointing Abu Ubaidah in his place. We don't know if this was part of the reforms, or as some sources claim, it happened due to the previous animosity between the new caliph and the general. In any case, it seems that before the messengers could reach Damascus, the 3-day peace the Muslims promised Thomas had passed, and Khalid, alongside 5,000 cavalry, guided by Jonah, started pursuing the Romans. Thomas had around 10,000 people with him, both soldiers and citizens of Damascus, but instead of finding refuge in one of the nearby towns, this group was heading towards Antioch, and that allowed the Arab cavalry to catch up to them to the south of Latakia sometime in late September. The details of the engagement, now known as the Battle of Maraj al-Dabaj, are scarce, but according to the Muslim sources, a cavalry detachment of a few hundred caught up and took position to the south of Thomas. The Romans immediately noticed them, deciding that they would be able to defeat this small group with ease. To the surprise of the Romans, as soon as the Arab cavalry and Roman infantry started fighting, another group of Khalid's horsemen appeared to the east. Although the Romans had thousands of refugees in their midst, they still outnumbered the Muslims, and a portion of their infantry formed up to face the new threat. However, a half hour after the battle was joined here, a third group of Arab cavalry started charging from the north, and the Romans barely got into a defensive formation in time to prevent it from breaking through. Thomas's situation was becoming dangerous, as the route to Damascus was now cut off, but the Romans were still fighting on an equal footing, and the battle raged on 3 sides. An hour later, Khalid himself appeared to the west with the largest part of his army and charged the Romans. Despite the fact that Thomas managed to get a few units to this front, they were swept aside almost immediately, and the Arab cavalry was now deep inside the Roman formation. Thomas was soon killed. The Roman resistance continued for some time, but was broken within an hour. Some soldiers and refugees managed to slip away to the north, but the majority of the Romans were either killed or captured. Khalid lost just a few hundred troops. Immediately afterwards, the Arabs headed to Damascus and reached it in early October. Apparently, Abu Ubaidah already received the messenger from the Caliph and informed Khalid of his demotion. According to sources, the latter accepted it without much protest, but it did change the flow of the Caliphate's expansion in the region. Abu Ubaidah was much slower and more deliberate than Khalid. Umar preferred a more hands-on approach to the armies, often issuing orders after every engagement, which slowed down the campaigns due to the distance to Medina. He even placed informers in the army, which made Abu Ubaidah even more careful in his decisions. At the same time, the Muslims received some reinforcements, bringing the total number of their troops to 30,000. However, that wasn't the only change in command made by Umar, which brings us back to Iraq, where Khalid left Muthanna in charge of a 9,000-strong army in 634.
Okay, that'll be it for the second part. So again, it's interesting with all these engagements and how the Arabs have the upper hand against what some say would be better prepared armies, and and a lot of it's been due to their general Khalid ibn al-Walid, who's been proven to be one hell of a general. And as I said, my knowledge on this subject is very limited, so I apologise if I get any of the details wrong or I butcher any of the names. So by the looks at the third and final part of the reaction to this first episode, be concentrating on the Arabs going back to face the Sassanids again. So that'll be it for part 2 of the reaction to this first episode. So if you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.